Many of you know I am a teacher by training. I just finished my 23rd year as a professor, the last 19 of them at Wheaton College. What I am typically not is a preacher. See, teachers explain where preachers proclaim. Teachers clarify, they help us understand things, where preachers exhort. So I want to thread the needle a little bit this morning and do a little bit of each, a little teaching and a little preaching. I want to help us understand the concept of play, and then I want us to invite us to think deeper about the God of play. George Herbert Mead, in his theory of symbolic interactionism, suggested that meaning is not in people, but in things. It's not in things, but in people. We assign meaning towards something, and we act according to the meaning we have assigned it. So, if the Bible is a book, you treat it like any other book. You act according to the meaning that you have for it. If you thought of it as a sacred letter, you might treat it differently. Either way, you are orienting or acting towards the object according to the meaning that you have for it. So it's a pretty good place for us to start this morning. What does play mean to you? Because that's how you will act towards it. What does play mean? So let me start with a little bit of a word association game. When I say play, what do you think about? If you're a note taker, you might put that in the margins. Maybe you think of walking on the beach or playing in the sand. That's me. And that's my sister. 50 years ago. So maybe that's what you think of when you think of play, is you think of playing in the sand. Or maybe you're thinking about a sport or a video game. Are you thinking about pong or ping pong? Maybe you think about music and playing the piano or the guitar. Or maybe a Muppet sing-along, hypothetically, tomorrow at 7 p.m. But what does play mean to you? Describing something and defining it is a good way to get into this question. The problem here is that play is a slippery word to define. You see, when you give something definition, you have to have some rigidity to it. That is what it means to define something, to put it in the finite. But you have to have some elasticity with this particular concept because you're talking about a pretty diverse set of things here. So what does it mean to describe something instead of to define it? So to define gives a fixed boundary, but to describe allows some flexibility or variability. Let me give you an example. Think of the most attractive person you know. Now, define what makes them attractive. It's hard, right? But if I asked you to describe what it is that you find attractive about them, it's a lot easier. It's more, you can get your hands on that. And so in the same way, we can start with play and we can say, let's describe what it is. And in contrast, in a bit of a, putting it in a comparison frame can help because it pulls it apart from other things. And so the most classical distinction that we make is that play is different from work or duty, right? That on the one hand, work is labor. It is necessary. It's appointed time or designated time. It's also outcome dependent. Leisure, of which play is usually a part of, is seen as unappointed time. It's undesignated. It's not outcome dependent. The Cat in the Hat understood this, right? He declared, this was no time to play. This was no time for fun. This was no time for games. There was work to be done. Dr. Seuss was a play theorist, right? He understood that these were different constructs, work and play. The problem is that we typically have a Protestant work ethic, but we lack a complementary play ethic. Gordon Dahl, who's an economist at the University of California, San Diego, said this: most middle-class Americans tend to worship their work, work at their play, and play at their worship. What he meant by that is we're devoted to our labor. We are often hyper-competitive in the ways that we play, and we mess around with worship. But we need to reintegrate these concepts because they've been tragically separate for too long. Work without play is more damaging than making Jack or Jill a dull boy or girl. Play apart from work is self-centered, indulgent, addictive. And worship without an element of play can become somberly pious, and we run the risk of missing the party that is the kingdom of God. So we've got to put them back together somehow. We can take another approach to understanding what play means by looking at what is most essential about it. What is the defining features? So these come from the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And they said there's 5 essentials that make up play that I think will work here in the church context as well. So the 5 elements to play, the 5 essentials to play. First, that it is one's own decision. You can't make someone play. You can't coerce them or force them to do it. They have to choose to do it. The second is that play is intrinsically motivated. It's also called autotelic. This means I do it for its own satisfaction. Play is its own reward. I'm doing it for the joy of doing it, the joy of having completed it. This is different from extrinsic motivation, right? Where you do something in order to get a reward outside of the thing itself. And so I do something because then you will reward me for having done it. Play, in this case, though, is an end unto itself. Play is the reason that we are doing it. Third element of play is that it is immersive. In other words, we lose track of time. Have you ever played and you've lost track of the time or the place even? You went, wait, what time is it? Where do we start? Because what happens is time seems to move at a different pace when we're playing. This is also pointed out to us when we try and multitask, right? Have you ever played a game with somebody and then turn to do something else and they quickly call you out on it and say, you're not playing? Why? Because they understand that play is immersive, that play is consuming. The fourth element is that play is spontaneous. What I mean by this is it is non-scripted, or it's not planned. It has freedom of choice. Okay? You're able to make some choices and your flexibility in the way those choices develop. You have some control over the game. And then finally, play is enjoyable. We know that it actually is restorative. It's pleasure-oriented. When you play, different parts of your brain light up. That we know that. We understand that there's an emotional reaction to play. Play refuels the tank. It is energy restorative, even if it is resource depleting. And so undoubtedly you have come in and been very tired from a full day of play. If you haven't, you have seen a child do so. Right? The play is exhausting and yet enjoyable and restorative. Before we go one more step, we can talk about what play is not. And I think we have to debunk a couple of myths about play here. Things that are believed to be true about play, because then when we put them into a theological context, we're going to have to wrestle with some of these concepts. The first is that play is shallow. Because when you say something is shallow, it lacks depth or nuance or meaning. I would argue that play is very consequential. It is very meaningful to people. It's low risk, but that doesn't mean it is of low importance. But instead, play is an important function for many of us. The second myth that we need to debunk is that play is a distraction. It keeps you from being productive. That it is a waste of time. It moves away from something and becomes a non-essential. When in fact, play might actually be exceptionally productive or allows us to be exceptionally productive, right? Play isn't a waste of time. It's the way that we cope with life. It's the things that we do that give us release. We know that play, for both young and old, stops repetitive patterns in the head, allows you to be more creative, allows you to think more originally. We know that play actually physically engages different parts of the brain, but also different parts of the body. And all those things work together better once we have integrated play into the story. As part of Wheaton's promotion process, we do a faith and learning paper. I would tell you I probably wrote about 75% of that paper out on my bike. Because while I was doing that, I could think better. I could think differently. And then when I returned to my computer, it came a lot easier than if I had not done that. It's a very productive time. The third is that play is entertainment. Kurt Cobain, the late Kurt Cobain of Pearl Jam, said, "Here we are, now entertain us." He understood that entertainment comes to you. Entertainment is at best a spectator sport. Entertainment happens to you, but play is participatory. It is active. It invites you in. And so to say play is entertainment suggests that it is not as active a component as it is. And finally, the belief that play is only for children. The crux of this myth is that play is silly, that it is foolish, that it's something we should grow out of when we get bigger and grow up. Play is, in fact, part of childhood. The late Mr. Rogers said, quoting Marie Montessori, by the way, "Play is often talked about as if it was a relief from serious learning, but for children, play is serious learning. Play is really the work of childhood." Mr. Rogers understood that play isn't just for children. It's a process of learning. Now, I'm actually not going to fight this myth too much, because my deductive reasoning tells me if my faith ought to be like a child, and play is part of childhood, then maybe play is part of our faith as well. It's a vain process to try and look in the scriptures for a fully fleshed out theology of play. There's no account in the scripture that Jesus played any games. We have no evidence that he knew how to play the guitar or the piano, though it seems like everybody in ministry does. Perhaps it's less important that we come up with a theology of play than we factor play into our theology and find a playful theology. So what does it have to do with God? What does it have to do with the Almighty? Frederick Buechner said the distinction between the profane and the sacred is that we need to make stuff of this earth point to the eternal. My friend Keith Johnson, a theologian at Wheaton, says, theology is just thinking, speaking, and reasoning about God. So as we start to ask the questions, what does God mean for play? And what does God think about play? We are doing the work of theology. We are asking the question, what does it mean to God? And based on his meaning, how does it change our meaning? I want to work towards a playful theology by walking through a series of questions that are intended to encourage us to think theologically about play and to move it from the realm of teaching to preaching, right? To ask the question, what does play mean to God? The first question is, what is true of God? This is called the transcendentals of God. It's what's in the foreground. It's what's foundational. Transcendentals is a theological, it's a philosophical notion. To ask the question, it's a really classic way of reasoning, is to say, what is in the foreground of which nothing is contingent upon? There's no context, there's no, it transcends time or place. What is true in the foreground? What is the essence of the thing? First things don't derive from anything, they are the origin of the thing. Nothing precedes them, they are rooted in the being. So my question is, what is true of God, and how does it relate to play? What is the first things of God? God is not good because of the good things he does. God is good, and he does good things. Goodness is in the foreground. Goodness is one of the transcendentals of God. The Catholic Church says there's 3 transcendental first things of God: that he is true, that he is good, and that he is beautiful or imaginative. Those are the first things of God. All things that flow from him will have that character. That's what a transcendental means. That everything that comes from that source will look like that source. True, good, and beautiful. So what does it mean about play? Well, we know that he creates things that play. Gene stole my thunder here a little bit, but I'll say it anyway. Psalm 104, the psalmist writes, "Here in the ocean vast and wide, teeming with life of every kind, both large and small, see the ships sailing along, and the Leviathan, which you made to play in the sea." The Message interprets it as the Leviathan who romps in them. And the contemporary English says, the Leviathan, the monster you created, who splashes about in the sea. Now, there's some dispute on what a Leviathan actually is, whether it's an actual being or something mythic. But what the psalmist is clear on is that God creates things that play. We know that play is part of God's past, present, and future. Right? We heard it read this morning, Tamara read from Zechariah 8, the future Zion, the city of hope. Did you catch the end part of that? Boys and girls play there. We know play is part of the future. The Australian sociologist Peter Berger said, when play is at its best, something of the presence of God breaks into our lives and the redemptive powers are experienced. The American sociologist and former Baptist minister, Tony Campolo, said this: "This is what God's kind of partying is supposed to do for us. At best, it's supposed to give us a taste of the glory that is to come. It ought to be a time when something of the celebration which is already going on in heaven breaks into our lives." So what does it tell me about how God sees play? It tells me that God is pro-play. What does it say about play? It says that things that are derived from him, when he is the source and when it is linked to the source, play, derivative of God, the origin, is true and good and beautiful, because that is its source. The first question. Which brings me to the second question: how does it change our view of the Sabbath? The Sabbath is God's plan for rhythm and rest. So how does play factor into that? Is your view of a week, 1 week equals 6 days of hard labor and 1 day of rest and recline? If so, does that mean you can only play after all of the hard work is done? I would challenge you to consider that this is a distorted notion of the Sabbath. Do we really think that after 6 days of creating, God was tired and he needed a day off? I don't think so. And if you do, we should go back to talking about the indefatigable God who does not grow weary. It tells us, though, that God rested in play, and he rested in creation, in appreciation. I don't think he needed, after 6 days, he needed a break. He wasn't looking for the couch. Instead, he wanted to play and rest in that which he had created, which was good. He wanted to relish that which was good. It's not about passivity, the Sabbath, but instead about worship and adoration and communion. So how do I think about the Sabbath? Do I take delight in it? Do you? Do we think about play in this context as restoring or recreating the holistic human? Or is it just about recreating? Which brings us from him to us, right? And when we switch to this gear, we say, what does it mean? What is true of humans? Theologians call this theological anthropology. It's pretty consistent in the field of play that people learn through play. We learn cognitively how to problem solve. We learn physically how to do things. We learn verbally what to say. We learn socially how to interact. But that's putting us at the center of the story. And theological anthropology doesn't ask that question. It doesn't foreground the person. Instead, it focuses on the creator and then sees that which has been created. We are on the creature side of the creation divide. And we have been created in a body, and in a body that plays. Did you know that today, in the liturgical calendar, is the celebration day for the most holy body and blood of Christ? It is the Corpus Christi in the liturgical calendar today. It is the day in the calendar to contemplate that Jesus had a body. He lived in a body. We are not just brains on a stick. We have bodies as well. And those bodies are not a prison. My friend Beth Fokker-Jones, who's also a theologian, says bodies are integral into God's good intention for you. God cares about your body. We play in that body. We learn in that body. We use that body in worship. David knew this. He, the man after God's own heart, sang and danced before the Lord. And when he was rebuked by his wife for doing so, David's reply, I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord. So I will celebrate before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes. In 2 Samuel. He used his body to celebrate his God. A playful theology means we have to wrestle with the notion that God made us in a body and with a mind and the ways that he has equipped those minds and bodies. What was their original purpose? What was he thinking? These kind of questions dive us more into understanding God and his plan for us. Another less preeminent theologian, Billie Eilish, said last year on the Barbie soundtrack in her Oscar award-winning song, I used to float, and now I just fall down. I used to know, and I'm not sure now what I was made for. What was I made for? Think I forgot how to be happy, something I'm not, but something I can be. Something I wait for, something I'm made for. I think Billie Eilish understands something about God. How does play factor into his design for us? Maybe play is part of the holistic flourishing of the human created by God. But what does it mean to say that not only are we created, but we are created in his image, imago Dei? What is your relationship of that? What is your image of that relationship between you and God? If we are created in his image, what is the relationship between the image bearer, us, and the thing that it reflects, God? When people see you, what of God do they see reflected? When they see us at play, what are we reflecting of God? Now, we need to avoid getting locked into particular ways of understanding that relationship. We run the risk here of having a fairly limited understanding or imagination as to what our relationship is like with God. If we see God as an omniscient protector and an overlord, you don't play much with an overlord, do you? You cower in fear of punishment. And if you see God, Stan, as a mean judge who's waiting to bring down the hammer, I try not to mess up. I don't play. But if I see God as the father to the prodigal son, the loving father to a beloved child, what happens when that son or daughter shows up? That father ran, and he jumped, and he partied, and he played. Again, my friend Keith, a theologian at Wheaton, when I asked him what best embodies play in the Bible, he pointed to that story, the prodigal son, and he said, Emily, that father gets what it means to play. If God is standing at the end of the driveway waiting for you or waiting for me, waiting to dance, I hope we dance. So what's my relationship to God? Created in his image, designed with the capacity to play, to point to the Creator through my play. Play is in fact the full imago Dei, the full manifestation of my reflected Creator. So how does play help us foster a holy imagination? Because we have to think of ourselves in the story of God. We have to get into that story, and that takes a little bit of a playful imagination. You need to see what isn't in front of you. You need to get into that space. It's an act of play. The capacity to think about worlds beyond the world in front of you, to enter imaginatively into heaven's realms. That's an act of play. We know through play things like pretend and imaginary friends. We learn how to interact with people that we don't see. What does that tell us about learning to interact with God? We also learn to keep the roles separate. What does that mean about interacting with God? How might play help us enter the realm of heaven? What is his role and what is mine? A holy imagination was also part of Jesus as a storyteller. He used the world around him to tell the stories he wanted people to understand, but they would have to see things that they did not see. They would have to know what could not be known or could not be seen. In Matthew 23, Matthew writes, quoting Jesus, "Woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint and dill and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strained the gnat, but you swallowed the camel." He wanted us to understand the concept of misprioritization. But it takes a holy imagination to imagine swallowing a camel. You have to have a developed capacity to see what is not in front of you. And through play, perhaps we enter the extraordinary by way of the ordinary, in the words of Frederick Buechner. Play is to try and grasp the mind of God. We pray, give us your eyes that I may see. But maybe through play, we develop a way to see and see like God. And finally, I ask, do you believe in the God of wonder? I was talking to my friend who's a biologist. She's actually a parasitologist. She studies raccoon poop. And I asked Kristen what her theology of play is. And she said, Emily, I believe in the God of wonder. You see, wonder is surprise mixed with adoration and delight. It is to look at the unexpected, the unanticipated, the unthinkable, the impossible, and to know that those words do not apply to God. Think about playing in the wonder that is God's created world, in the Black Hills of South Dakota and the Badlands, which is where the Hickoxes are this week. My prayer is that they encounter the God of wonder as they play in his Black Hills. I return to Kristen's example. She sees the God of wonder in his creation. She does this exercise with her students where she brings in a hunk of soil, a hunk of dirt, and she tells them to play in the dirt as a way of knowing. And so they dig in the dirt and in the soil for the bugs and the worms. And then she takes a piece of it and puts it on the slide and bumps up the magnification, and wow, all the microorganisms that are going on in there. In that, she looks at all of the life in a piece of dirt. But she plays in the dirt as a way to see the God of wonder. She doesn't see the dirt on the slide. She sees the God of wonder. And playing in the dirt is the way that she understands God. Now, I don't play in the dirt very often, except in my garden, but I am an animal person. So let's talk about animals, because that's where I see the God of wonder. If you ask me what the God of wonder looks like, I would tell you about the gorilla. Do you know that gorillas in the wild hum while they eat? No particular reason, just musical delight. It's not territorial, it's not defensive, and it's apparently a different composition for every meal. What kind of God makes a huge silverback gorilla who breaks into improv as he munches? What kind of God is that? I would tell you it's about living in the world where there are striped tigers, or dolphins that jump out of the ocean, or the giraffe. Who designed that thing? That makes no logical sense. And yet, diversity in design, highly efficient, highly varied. And through play, I encounter the God of wonder. Stingrays that glide through the water in Belize make me just absolutely breathless. Not about the stingray itself, but about the God that made them. And where did I encounter this beauty? It was on my last sabbatical. I spent some time off the coast of Belize. It was part of my sabbatical plan. I knew I needed rest. I knew I needed to play. I needed renewal, and I needed God to see God anew. So he took me to San Pedro, which is off the Belizean coast, to the second largest barrier reef in the world. And there, swimming with the sharks and the sea turtles and the stingrays and playing in the water, one encounters the God of wonder. But unfortunately, I can't go to Belize every day. But when I cannot see the God of wonder, on my very low days and on my worst days, I'm lucky because I live with this one. And he shows me the God of wonder. God is not simply efficient or mechanistic. He is true and good and beautiful. Gunther, the cat Slinky, as he tumbles down the stairs, this is a fairly regular occurrence in our house. Why does he do this? Because he plays. And he was created with the capacity to play, because play is true and good and beautiful from the source. So why should we develop a theology of play or put play in our theology? Because it reveals something of the character of God, because it transforms our understanding of the Sabbath. We reflect the image of our Creator through play, and we get a deeper understanding of the nature of that relationship. Play fosters our imagination, and it helps us believe in the God of wonder.